Hello everyone. I just wanted to interrupt your lunch. I just want to get this talk rolling. I'm Nan Hien, a freelance journalist. I also sit in the professional committee that organizes these events. Before I begin though, can I just ask everyone to silence your phones or any devices that are going to potentially interrupt the talk? Thank you. And as usual, I'm going to highlight some events that are coming up. We have on September 20th our first ever poetry event. To entice you, there's going to be tapas and cheese, and there's also going to be a wine buffet for an extra $20, which really trying to try different events at the club, so please come. And there's also another talk with Liu Chintong, the Defense Minister of Malaysia. And he's going to talk on September 26th. There's a few seats left, so please come to that. Thanks all for joining us our talk about academic freedom in a world of authoritarianism. I'm honored to present our speaker today, Dr. Tim Pringle, a senior lecturer, not single lecturer. Sorry. He's not single, he's happily married at the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And he's also the editor of the China Quarterly. As many of you know, late last year, the China Quarterly was at the center of the battle over censorship in China. Our speaker was at the front line of this, so he has a real sense of the significant challenges in academic freedom today, but not just in China, around the world, and the constraints that researchers face in areas besides authoritarianism, but also populism and so forth. So without further ado, Dr. Tim Pringle.
Okay, thank you for that very kind introduction. Yes, I am happily married, yeah. Okay, so what I want to do, I've only got 20 minutes. I got 12 slides after this one, so I'm kind of gallop through it a little bit. So what I'm not going to do is talk about what you guys will know pretty much as what I know about, as well as I do, about the issues around China Quarterly, the Cambridge University Press, and a certain import agent around Beijing last year. If you want to bring or hone in on those incidents during the Q&A, please do. Instead, what I want to use these 20 minutes for is to kind of think a little bit more broadly about notions of academic freedom, the related topics of university or institutional autonomy, very topical here in Hong Kong, I understand, and also to look at threats to academic freedom, which don't just come purely from authoritarian states, but from other forces as well. Okay, so that's roughly what I'm going to do. Why do it? Why talk about it? Well, it's interesting. Not many of us really think very much about the notion of academic freedom. It has crossed my radar. I research fairly sensitive subjects of labor relations, labor movements in China, Vietnam, and Russia. So it's crossed my radar for sure. And obviously, as editor of China Quarterly, it's become a major focus. But within the academe itself, as I'll demonstrate during this talk, it's not or wasn't. It is becoming, but it wasn't a particularly hot topic. But a few definitions. World of authoritarianism. Without reading through the definition that I've come up with there, based on some of the literature on this, I think we can summarise this as a generalised rejection of liberal governance and accountability. Now, that might come along with the absence of democratic electoral processes, the presence of very repressive and unaccountable security agencies. It's different from a totalitarian state. I haven't been invited for obvious reasons, but I could give at least versions of this talk in Beijing. Okay, so I think I could anyway. All right, so Beijing, I believe, is not yet I hope it won't become a totalitarian state, or it's not all China isn't. These dimensions that I mentioned are not fixed in time or space. Degrees of authoritarianism change according to various forces. But I think the typical characteristics that we can look at here are, as I said, the lack of party elections, a civil society subject to surveillance control, government-controlled media, lack of independent judiciary, rule of law, lack of rule of law, etc. However, authoritarianism isn't limited, in my view, to authoritarian states. And what we're seeing, I would say, certainly over the last decade, maybe a little bit less, is the rise of authoritarian, or the return of authoritarian practices in notionally liberal and democratic states. I would link this, I'm not going to talk in any depth about populism at this talk, but I would link this to the rise of populism. The obvious example being some interpretations of Brexit in the UK, or the rise of Trump in the US. But, you know, we need to look further afield as well. This strong man is there in Russia, in Putin, in Xi Jinping, in China, Duterte in Philippines, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey. All of these individuals have, aside from taking repressive measures against civil society, have also, in one way or another, directed their ire and their fire, sometimes literally, at academics. So this stuff is important to academics and academic freedoms. Some of this comes through the rise of the alt-right and populism. Some of it comes through what Gordon Brown, in an interview in The Guardian yesterday, day before, referred to as the silos of nationalism and national stability based on illiberalism. And I would argue, in my sector, some of it comes through the application of market fundamentalism, short-term profits and accumulation, and the commodification of public services, including higher education. This has led to a rise in managerial dominance in the institutions, or a trend in that, or trend therein, which is required to impose these notions. Interestingly, these notions can, and China is a perfect example of, or an example of this, of how this kind of authoritarian practices, both in liberal and authoritarian states, can promote and constrain civil society. No one would argue that China has seen a massive rise in civil society organizations in number, numerically, in the last 20 years. Equally, nobody would argue the impact of, less so the charities law, but certainly the foreign NGO law since 2017, and the legal constraints. And behind that, and moving beyond China to some of those countries and leaders I've mentioned before, we've seen this come along with a security agenda, the securitization of discourse in some ways. Prevent in the UK, you may not know this, but it's a policy, a government policy, ostensibly designed to beat or make an early warning system against terror attacks, but it actually has a significant effect on Muslim students in the classroom and in the academe as well. The state of emergency in Turkey against 1,000 academics who signed a petition for peace and who are now subject to the loss of their jobs and worse. The FNGO law in China and the handing over of civil society management to this Public Security Bureau instead of the Ministry for Civil Affairs. Beyond this security narrative, of course, we see the goons as well, the intimidation and worse. And I will end on this, I'll come back to this at the end. If anybody of you is not following or not registered with organisations like Scholars at Risk or Concern or Committee for Concern for Academics, please do have a look at these organisations. They do an important job. So against this context, what's the implication for academia? Well, or for academic freedom, rather. Well, first of all, we need to clarify that. And as Polanyi told us back in 1944, the famous economist, that clarifying the assumptions on which freedom rests, such as academic freedom, is both a practical and public interest and makes them more secure. But my sector, despite all the huffing and puffing, we've actually done a pretty poor job in defining and nailing down this concept. McGuinness in 2002, a well-known American academic, brought this home in a paper, and many and others have found that some of the notions and huffing puffing around academic and freedom is based on untested assumptions by self-serving professors, of which I hope I'm not one. The UCU, my own trade union, carried out an extensive survey over the last 2 years, and the results of which were published by Terence Caron, and has found that a third of UK academics and just short of 30% of EU academics felt that they did not have an adequate working knowledge of what academic freedom meant. So let's try and pin it down. What exactly am I talking about? We've looked at authoritarianism and how we can't restrain authoritarianism to authoritarian practices, to authoritarian states. Let's try and pin down academic freedom. Briefly, I think, and this is drawing on UNESCO's recommendations, drawing on the American Association of Professors and the Council of Europe in 2012, to try and bring, as Karen and Melanson have called it, substantive and supportive elements to this concept of academic freedom. Well, one is obvious. It's the freedom to teach. Course content, how you teach, who teaches, whom shall be taught, and the methods of assessment deployed therein. Secondly, and I think crucial as well to this, is the freedom to research. What you research, what methods do you use to research your research, to answer your research questions? What is the purpose of your research? And above all, what means do you use to disseminate it? And looking at a working paper by, turning back to China, looking at a working paper by Gratins and Trurex, who took a survey of, I think it was 500 or more, maybe quite a lot more, I can't remember the exact figure, of foreign scholars working in China. They found that while 9% of Chinese scholars, foreign scholars working in China had been taken for tea by the by the authorities in China, and that 26% of scholars who conduct archival research were being denied access. They found this to be a rare but significant phenomenon, i.e. the fact that you were being taken for tea. So although the issue perhaps, I was quite surprised by these figures, and obviously we're looking forward to the paper that they're publishing on it. It's not as widespread as perhaps some of us think of this, although maybe that will come up in the discussion afterwards. But it is a significant problem, and of course then there's the question of self-selection and self-censorship around even your answers to an anonymous survey. But these two substantive elements, freedom to teach and freedom to research, they need to be supported by what I would regard as the close cousin or close relation to academic freedom, and this is the notion of university autonomy. Now, back in the UK, turning back to the survey in my country, 55% of UK academics believe that their university's autonomy has declined in recent years. The same equally alarming figures for academic freedom as well. How? Why has this happened? Well, I'm going to argue here, and before we turn to China itself, is that part of this is about the rise of what I call managerialist, not what I call, what other scholars have called managerialist practices inside the academe. An obsession with performance management and evaluations, a removal or weakening of tenure, competition as a driving force of the higher education market. Now, I'm not arguing here that in this context that competition is a poor thing, but applied as it has been applied to in higher education, what we are doing, in my belief, is creating a supermarket product to be picked by students and picked by students as consumers. The English government, the British government right now is currently conducting a review of higher education in China, in the UK, whoops, in the UK, and in it has not ruled out the idea of individual courses competing against each other within the same institution. So, for example, I teach development economics. There's a number of options available on that, and so it's not unlikely that, hey, if you buy this course for 12 grand, then we'll throw in a couple of optional courses for free. We're looking at loss lead. We're looking at a ludicrous concept of looking at market fundamentalism being brought to the higher education sector. If people here think that is a good thing, then let's debate it, because it's very important. Fourth reason is the obsession with university rankings and the absence, interestingly, in these global university rankings, which are so important to universities around the world, of academic freedom and autonomy as measurement criteria, even though Karen and Mallison have very clearly pointed out, two well-known academics pointed out, that there is a direct link between scholarly excellence and academic freedom and the reputation of a university. So actually it's in the interests of university institutions to protect their own autonomy and to ensure that academic freedom becomes a guiding principle, not just on paper, but in practice. A fourth reason is the generalized precarity at one end of the university career structure and managerialism at the other. Highly paid managers, sometimes not strictly accountable to a senate or a council, taking decisions and issuing work contracts to people lower down the scale who are desperate to publish their research to have an influence on their field, but are being hindered by increasing precarity, to the point where Hao Zhidong, writing in the Chinese Sociological Review, has argued that academic freedom and traditional professorial roles are being strained by the pressures of what he calls commercialism and corporatization. In short, universities are becoming sites of contestation over university autonomy, business practices, and/or the employment conditions and the well-being of the people who work them. And if you look at almost any recent research on the mental health within the academe, be it in China, Turkey, the UK, America, it's a sorry state of affairs. So these, I would argue, are impacting adversely on academic freedom. How am I doing for time?
10 minutes.
Okay, cool. So turning to academic freedom in China, and China as an authoritarian state that has has turned to capitalism, for want of a better term, in order for its developmental project, provides a site where the pressures of authoritarianism and what I would call market fundamentalism have come together to bring to act as severe constraints on research in China. Which is not to say, by the way, that there isn't some excellent research coming out of China, either through cooperation with university scholars outside of China, or indeed, of course, from Chinese scholars themselves. But it's not easy, and it's getting much, much harder. Okay? The presence of the party at all levels of university governance. This is something we all think is there, but talking to deans and or researchers who are talking to deans or talking to senior figures in the Chinese academe will confirm this. The monitoring and rendering of university research and teaching activities has become much more affected by the administratization, 是以say in Chinese, 行政化, of university management. Appointments are vetted very carefully, and I'm not just talking about a rigorous search and interview process. I'm talking about political vetting and making sure people going through what people have said, their research, and what they publish about in the past. Course content and approval of new programs is getting increasingly is monitored more and more tightly. And as we've seen, this isn't just limited to China. Sometimes the limitations on classroom discussion, as we've seen by Prevent in the UK, but what's happening in China and that tightening up doesn't just stay in China. It has impacted on academics teaching China elsewhere. I should say it's never happened to me at SOAS and at other institutions. It's not something that I can imagine happening, but we have to take people at the word. Particularly the Australian academic, my apologies if he ever sees this film, I can't remember his name, but obviously it happened, and it can't be a very pleasant experience either. Autonomy. Interestingly, in China, there were attempts, or university autonomy, there were attempts in the Ministry of Education regulations of 2011 to revise university charters aimed at increasing the autonomy from the government. And indeed, a report by the US Congress Government Accountability Office found that looking at just 12 universities that had agreements with Chinese universities and had activities in China, found that those agreements all contain language protecting academic freedom. However, they also found that internet access is curtailed in at least 6 of these 12 universities, and also self-censorship in the classroom was a frequent issue over sensitive topics. I'm sure people in this room know as much about them as I do. But more important, or equally important, I think, is that any progress that those 2011 regulations seem to signal has been slowed, and again, you guys will know this as well as I do, by the reversed changing political environment. The academic, I don't know if anyone here has tried to organise a conference in China. I've organised or been involved in organising them over the last 10 years, I think 15 years. It's getting a lot harder. There's a lot more boxes to tick and forms to fill, and the relationship with your interlocutor in China has become more and more tense, I think, or cautious. In terms, as Goldman has put it, of the state's influence over the notion, and it is in Chinese traditions, there is a notion of the public intellectual. The relative autonomy of the late 90s and the early years of the Hu Jintao Wenjiabao area have been curtailed, or are being curtailed. Nothing new here. But what I think, if we dig down a bit more deeply, a paper by Yao in 2014, published, and here's a bit of advertising in the China Quarterly, talks, interesting, of the politics of depoliticization. So we all know in China that China has a reputation, puts great store on education, and indeed in Chinese history, students have often been at the forefront of significant protests and change. With now over 2,000, almost 2,500 universities, and in 2014, 22 million college students, that tradition will obviously worry the Chinese authorities, particularly after 1989. The response has been, as Rachel Hayhoe, as early as the early 90s, and others have documented, and Yao has documented, has been the increasing influence of student political councillors, once ridiculed by students in China, but now taken far more seriously, at a ratio, particularly when there's a ratio of 1 to 200. A consultation system, or a pastoral system, in inverted commas, that links mental health with radical ideas and regime legitimacy, which is really, really damaging, I think, or really, really ominous there. The increasing importance of the student party branch, and also the political classes, material incentives, and the combination of traditional morals and a Chinese version of socialism have combined to produce what Yao called a docile and deactivated student body. And indeed, I hope I messed it up. As far as I know, there hasn't been a major student movement since 1989 in China. Am I right, or is Yao right or wrong? Not a major one. So this is, sorry, in mainland China, yeah, obviously. This is what. Is it ritual compliance? Yao Xiaojun addressed this, but ritual compliance is still compliance. And I should say that I'm not calling here for Chinese students to rise up. It's very easy to say that from the safety of London or the relative safety of Hong Kong. Of course I'm not saying that, but I'm just referring to Yao's research, which is that there has been a depoliticization of student politics in China. And Hong Kong. Well, you guys will know much more about this than myself. There's a clear link with the issue of academic freedom and university autonomy, and indeed creeping authoritarianism with the politics of one country, two systems. Carico has argued that while it is under threat, particularly from the backlash of the Occupy movement, since the Occupy movement, that although it still remains alive and well, and certainly my conversation with some academics over the last 3 or 4 days would certainly speak to that. There is a backlash in the city, a backlash against university autonomy that interestingly draws on the traditional practices left over from the Brits, from the colonial era, where the governor appointed university chancellors, where they could quite do what is happening or appears to be happening, as I understand it, at HKU, to stack university council. This is not new stuff. This is the expert applications of traditional colonial values, in my view. What next? Well, I think that we need to reaffirm that we need to go back. We need to go back to Polanyi. We need to realise that academic freedom is not something that can be played with market values or the applications of market fundamentalism. That we need to look. We need to say it's a collective and public good. not for the reproduction and production of a privileged sector, but something that informs policy, that unfettered research can have a really positive effect and positive outcome on society. I also think, and I would do as a union rep, that it is a trade union issue as well. I think the issue of academic freedom and university autonomy is closely linked to working conditions of academic workers, labour, if you like. And I think the absence, or the recent absence, of strong representation of academics in Hong Kong screams at us at the moment. To promote academic freedom in China, we need to identify what it is, not just in China, but in order to, we need to see what's happening elsewhere. We need to look at authoritarian practice in liberal democracies as well. It's no good just pointing the finger at China. We need to look at Turkey. India, academics in India are being burnt or beaten up. In Turkey, they're being fired. In America, they're being ridiculed. We need to develop those UNESCO guidelines and make them more practically applicable. And most of all, as I said earlier on, we need to look at the very useful and very valuable organisations like Scholars at Risk, like the Council for At-Risk Academics, and I'm sure there are others around the world, of course there are, that spend a lot of time protecting and trying to keep academics that have been fingered, if you like, out of danger, out of the firing line, so they can carry on with their research. So thank you for listening, and please hit me with the questions. Thank you.
Stay there. Yep.
Stay here.
I'm gonna.
Can't run away.
No.
Okay.
I'm gonna open questions to the floor. The mic is gonna be handed to you, so if you could state your name and organization that you're with, that'd be great. Thank you. Yep.
Thanks. Ben Bland. I'm a reporter for the Financial Times and a writer, and also graduate of SOAS and Cambridge, to declare my interest in the next question. How has China Quarterly been affected after Cambridge University Press reversed its initial decision to self-censor? Have you had any pushback in China, either in terms of institutions dropping their subscription or any other threats? And obviously it's an important question, because if in standing up to Beijing there is no pushback, it kind of suggests that others should do the same. I have a second question as well, which is, where do you draw the line between censorship and self-censorship? There's been quite a hot debate recently about whether or not academics should speak out on issues like Xinjiang, and some people say actually there's no such thing as self-censorship. If academics feel scared to research something, that's because someone else is censoring them, where others will say no, it's just weak, lily-livered Westerners who want access to money in China who are selling out.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Should we take one at a time? Or? Okay. So, pushback since CUP went along with the import agent and censored 300 articles in China Quarterly, which a decision that we then very quickly got reversed. I would imagine there will be pushback. I would imagine there will be a drop in institutional subscriptions. There are indications that there might be already, I'm not sure. But in terms of submissions to the journal from the mainland, if anything, and this is anecdotal, I don't have the stats on me, they've gone up rather than down. In terms of which doesn't necessarily translate into an increase in publication by authors from the mainland, because obviously all papers go through rigorous double-blind, and we're heading towards triple-blind review. China Quarterly's impact continues to rise. It still has the greatest impact of any China area journal on the planet, I think. Not that it's that many, but it does. It continues to rise. So in terms of that, I'm not saying I'm not worried. It's something that we think about all the time. It's something that we think about how we will deal, how, if there is very obvious pushback. But to date, to date, we're doing okay. All right, to date. Self-censorship. I've been following this debate. You know, on the one side we have, as James Label put it, Western academia's dirty little secret of self-censorship, and on the other hand we have people like Grayson's and Rory Truex, whose working paper I referred to in the talk, saying that the issue is much more complex than that. I side with. I thought that James Label did a good job in publicising that, in in getting that information or that opinion out in the open. I don't completely agree with it, but I think that it needs to be talked about. I don't think this is down to lily-livered, career-protecting Western academics. I think the equation or the scenario is more complex than that. And from somebody who works in one of the most sensitive areas of research, labour relations and labour movements, it's not just about what you as a principal researcher or you as a partner. You are a partner with researchers, be it in Russia, in my case Vietnam or China. You have to think of that partnership. At the same time, I think it is possible to say exactly what you want to say in a way that will never, you can never avoid censorship, but you can get your point across without by careful use of language. So I think the debate needs to be had. I think it's a good debate. I don't side on any particular side. I think that for me, that my baseline is the security and the safety of anybody I work with, and that be that in the UK, be that in China or anywhere. That is because it's easy to huff and puff from here or from my safe desk in SOAS. It's a lot more difficult when the knock on the door comes in the research area.
Any more questions? Lady at the front.
Hi, my name's Erin. I work for DPA, German press agency, but I also work at HKU's journalism school with my coworker here. So I'm not sure if maybe you've encountered this, but I just wanted to know your opinion on this issue where I think it's come up in Australia a lot, where you have people lecturing on issues about China, such as, or Taiwan even, and you have students from the mainland pushing back on the discussion, or you get what we've seen, I guess, anecdotally, is just sort of like this wall of silence where it seems like things that I would consider to be like a fact are not taken as such. And I think now you have this identity politics where people are like, oh, it's hurting my feelings that you say Taiwan is not part of China, or that it might be independent. Like, do you know what this phenomenon I'm talking about? Can you comment? Are you concerned about it? Or I've also seen it in Canada.
I referred to it in my talk.
Okay.
I referred to.
Can you say more?
Okay, so yeah, there have been incidences documented where students have taken objection to how a lecturer or an academic has framed a certain issue, usually around Taiwan, but it might be something else as well, or it could be Hong Kong, the issue around the debate or the issue around the future of Hong Kong. As I said, it's never happened to me. But it has been reported happening. That cannot happen. You cannot be threatened by students in your classroom, unless you're threatening them, of course, unless you're breaking university regulations. But you can. It's about freedom, pedagogy. It's about what you say. So yes, it shouldn't happen. And university deans, university chancellors, senates, and councils shouldn't let it happen. So that's where I stand on that. Has it ever happened to me? No. The wall of silence, I'm a little bit more sceptical about that. Because it's silence, we can't prove. Academics are worried about evidence and demonstrating. Because it's silence, there's nothing really to base your conclusions on. I've taught in the mainland, I've taught in Hong Kong, I've taught in the UK. The wall of silence. When I taught at a university here, I was teaching a course on Marxism and Chinese economics to an optional course to. They were electrical engineers. There was a significant wall of silence in that class, I can tell you that. Yeah? It was nothing to do with what I was saying or whether people felt confident enough. It may be linguistic, it may have been cultural. That said, I remember at the time I was also teaching in over the border. I was teaching European and British culture. The latter half being quite a short course, and keep up with it, guys. Keep up with it. And that I was teaching basically young, not wealthy, not star students, and that was a wall of noise. That was a wall of questions, albeit this is 15 years ago. So these things aren't that simple. But to go back, so the main point I want to make is that if it happens, it's bullying. It shouldn't happen. Just as academics shouldn't be subject to bullying from senior managers, they shouldn't be subject to bullying from their students either. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I can see how universities that really rely on student feedback surveys.
Aha.
That's also another issue where it's really based on...
I completely agree. And when I was, to my alarm, informed, in fact, when I checked yesterday that this talk was only 20 minutes long rather than the 45 minutes I planned, that would have been something I would have talked about in quite some detail. So yes, of course, there is another issue, another part of the pressure there is the student experience. So the product is not just about which is the cheapest and the best quality on the shelf and the buy one get one free idea. It's also about student feedback and the student experience.
Any more questions? Gentleman at the front. Yeah.
Hi, Tony Watson. I'm president of the Hong Kong Society of Financial Analysts. Just to put a finer point on the last question, can you comment on the role of the CSSA, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, and allied groups in mobilizing overseas Chinese students to take part in the phenomenon that was just discussed, the wall of silence and so on? Not only that, but also influence outside of classroom stuff, like appearances by the Dalai Lama on campus, and influences on, directly to university management. Okay,
I have to be honest, I can't comment directly because it's not something that I've researched. I can see that it is an issue. And again, I would argue that if the CSSA is mobilizing students to curtail academic freedom, then it is up to the university authorities to deploy their autonomy in order to stop that. I can see that would become a difficult issue when universities such as in the UK, if it happened there, are looking or seeking partnerships with institutions on the mainland. And again, I think we need to look beyond the bottom line, and we need to look at the protection of academic freedom and university autonomy. I don't want to comment in any more detail, simply because I can't at this stage. Yeah, my apologies.
And another question over there. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. It's very fascinating. I noticed you referenced Carrico's conclusion that academic freedom in Hong Kong is alive and well. Mm-hmm. But in your talk, you also pointed out that, I think correctly, that staff representation, it varies across. It's uneven across universities, but it's pretty weak. Mm-hmm. And not in the sense in the UK where you have a proper trade unions representation. So I think that in light of that, Carrico's conclusion is complacent and doesn't really represent the true situation. I mean, do you think that's the case?
Okay. Well, it's not my research, it's Carrico's research. He felt that, in the paper, he felt that academic freedom was under pressure in Hong Kong, and together with university autonomy. And interestingly, there's another report, quite an extensive report by Peterson et al., who look at the same issue really, but in the context of the politics of one country, two systems, which again, felt that the issue was under pressure, but also being debated. People weren't rolling over, and I think that is what I took from Carrico's paper. That although there is an issue here, and I think it's up to him to respond to whether he's been complacent or not. But I took optimism from that. Is that people are not rolling over, that there is issues that they're prepared to stand by, particularly over academic freedom. So that's how I'd respond to that. Yeah.
Any more questions at the back with Tripti?
Hi, Tripti from Quartz. So my question is sort of about China and not entirely about China. I think we all understand that people do see different things in history books when they're growing up, and as they move to another place and encounter different understandings, they might very well have pedagogical disagreements.
Sorry, could you put the mic a little closer? Can't seem to hear. Yes,
right,
perfect.
yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Just almost like stepping away from China, although I think that's the most obvious case in front of us right now. There are cases where people go abroad to study and they might encounter particular episodes of history or maps, actually I think is the key thing, that are different to what they've grown grown up seeing, and that encounter can be surprising and shocking. And I think part of the classroom experience is to discuss that and understand why have they come to it with this one knowledge, and there's another knowledge out there, which is, what is the true one. So what is the way for professors to engage with students who do come to them with these different backgrounds in a way that addresses the issue, maintains freedom, and doesn't tip over into maybe xenophobia as well?
Thank you. Well, that's a big question. As Ben will testify as a SOAS alumni, that SOAS, my university, responds to it with a pretty fierce critical assessment of the impact of colonialism on post-colonial societies. And that impact can be seen in reading lists, in course content, in the domination of the academe by scholars from the global north, usually male. So SOAS will bring to that a fierce critique of that. It's something. It's one of the reasons why I find my intellectual home at SOAS. I think that is one way of trying to address the culture conflict. It's not to approach new knowledge or challenging knowledge or critical ideas with an arrogant dismissal or a dismissal even, but to engage with it, to accept the legacies of history, to accept the challenges that ordinary people and academics face both in developed and developing countries. So that's what kind of guides me, really, and above all that, there is a culture shock. It's a culture shock the other way as well. But that's how I would respond to that. I know that's a very general. It's something that we discuss all the time at SOAS. In SOAS right now, there's a movement, a student-led movement called Decolonize the Campus, which is about these issues of the campus being dominated by research and researchers from researchers from the global north. I think, broadly speaking, that is a good aim. How we achieve it is something that is ongoing, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight, for sure. Does that answer the question? Please.
I guess to some extent, I'm sort of thinking, what is the ideal way for maybe, let's say, take the examples of Australia, of a teacher who's showing a map, and people are like, oh, this is not like a map I've seen before. Now, some of those could be maybe more political, maybe some of those are, allied with state organizations, and maybe some of the students are genuinely actually confused and sort of wanting to understand, like, what have I been learning all this time? So what? Yeah, in that situation, what is, how should like a person in that, and who's also, maybe they're precarious in their position and they do want to be able to keep teaching. So I just wonder, what can that person in that position maybe do?
Again, I would take us back to university autonomy. Protection for freedom to teach and freedom to research, backed up by those more supportive issues that I mentioned in the talk. I think that they aren't magic, what's it called, golden bullets or magic wands or something, but I think they are the basis on which these discussions, these issues can be addressed. If they are addressed as, well, this is the map, or this is how it was in India or wherever it be, or in South Africa, that isn't going to work. It's all about critical engagement, critical inquiry, about for me that is at the core of it, not a blanket, this is how it is. And it may be that authoritarian states do tend to come with that response, that this is how it is, and that's not something to emulate, I don't think. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Dr. Tim Pringle, everyone.